At 40,000 feet above the Korean peninsula, pilots did not hear the war coming. They felt it. In the sudden loss of control, in the violent pull of a climb that should not have been possible, and in the quiet terror of realizing that the sky itself had changed ownership. For the United States, this was not supposed to happen. American air power had ended the Second World War. American bombers had erased cities and forced surrender. American technology had rewritten the rules of modern warfare. Yet in the thin, frozen air above Korea, that certainty began to crack. Not with a dramatic defeat, not with a single catastrophic battle, but with a creeping realization whispered through cockpit radios and carried back to command rooms in Washington. Someone else had arrived in the jet age, and they were not behind. For years, air combat had followed rules written in blood during the Second World War. Speed mattered, firepower mattered, experience mattered. But altitude was a ceiling, not a weapon. Fighters fought below bombers, bombers flew beyond reach, and dominance followed predictable patterns. The Korean War was never meant to challenge that order. It began as a regional conflict, brutal and chaotic, fought by nations still exhausted from the global catastrophe that had ended only 5 years earlier. When American pilots entered the war, they did so with confidence, flying the most advanced Western jets of the era. The F-80 Shooting Star and later the F-84 Thunderjet were fast, powerful, and uncontested. Against North Korean propeller-driven aircraft, the skies belonged entirely to the United States and its allies. Bombing missions were conducted almost without fear. Air superiority was assumed, not questioned. For American planners, the war initially felt familiar. The B-29 Superfortress returned to the skies as it once had over Japan, carrying the quiet confidence of a weapon that had seemed unstoppable. Bomber formations moved methodically, escorted by fighters, striking targets with precision and withdrawing with discipline. To the men inside those aluminum giants, danger felt controlled, almost procedural. They trusted the altitude beneath them, the formation around them, and the belief that nothing could climb high enough or fast enough to truly threaten them. Once again, it seemed the sky belonged to America. That belief did not collapse all at once. It fractured slowly. Reports began filtering through American command channels, describing enemy aircraft moving faster than expected, attacking from above rather than below, and climbing away beyond pursuit. At first, these accounts were dismissed as exaggerations born of stress and confusion. But then came the losses. B-29s were torn apart in seconds. Entire formations shattered before escorts could respond. Missions were aborted mid-flight. Pilots spoke of silver. Swept-wing jets diving out of the sun, firing once and vanishing upward with ease. These were not propeller-driven interceptors. These were MiG F-15s, and they were hunting. Designed by the Soviet Union and deployed in secrecy through North Korean and Chinese markings, the MiG F-15 represented a leap forward in jet fighter design. It climbed faster, operated higher, and carried cannons capable of destroying a heavy bomber with a single burst. Most alarming of all, it fought where American aircraft struggled to follow. For the first time since World War II, American pilots were no longer moving freely through the sky. They were being watched, intercepted, and outmaneuvered in a realm they believed was secure. Inside many of those MiG cockpits, the pilots were not North Korean at all. They were Soviet veterans, some of whom had flown against the Luftwaffe only a few years earlier. Officially, the Soviet Union was not at war. Unofficially, it was very much present. These pilots operated under strict orders. They could not cross certain lines. They could not speak Russian over the radio. If captured, they would cease to exist politically. yet in the thin air above. Korea, ideology mattered less than performance, and for a brief, dangerous window of time, the MiG-15 appeared superior. American bomber crews felt the impact first. Aircraft that once symbolized overwhelming power now felt exposed, slow, and vulnerable. MiG attacks came from above and behind, ripping through formations before escorts could react. Losses mounted, mission profiles were altered, altitudes adjusted, escort formations reinforced. Eventually, daylight bombing gave way to night operations. But the damage had already been done. Confidence evaporated. This was no longer merely a tactical problem. It was psychological. The United States had entered the jet age, believing it led the world. Now, it faced the unsettling possibility that it did not. Over northwestern Korea, a narrow stretch of sky near the Yalu River became something else entirely. Pilots began to call it MiG Alley. Here, air combat was fought at the very limits of human and mechanical endurance. The MiG-15 dominated high-altitude engagements, striking and retreating with apparent impunity. To cross that invisible boundary in the sky was to invite sudden violence. The Cold War, though officially unspoken, had arrived at 40,000 feet. Shock, however, did not lead to paralysis. It triggered adaptation. Washington responded not with speeches, but with engineering. The F-86 Sabre, already in development, was rushed into combat. Sleek, fast, and equipped with advanced fire control systems, the Sabre was designed not just to meet the MiG-15, but to challenge it. Early encounters were sobering. On paper, the MiG still climbed faster and fought higher. Soviet pilots believed altitude was destiny. They believed the Americans would never fully close the gap. They were wrong. What unfolded over MiG Alley was not a simple contest of machines. It was a clash of philosophies. Soviet pilots relied on vertical maneuvers, using altitude as both shield and sword. American pilots adapted. They learned to exploit the Sabre's superior handling at high speed, its stability in dives, and the discipline of coordinated tactics. Dogfights became brutal chess matches played at near supersonic speeds, where a single mistake meant death. At those altitudes, oxygen was thin and reactions slowed. Engines flamed out, controls stiffened. Pilots pushed their aircraft beyond safe limits because the alternative was falling out of the sky in flames. Every engagement carried the knowledge that rescue was unlikely. Capture meant propaganda, imprisonment, or worse. For Soviet pilots, capture meant denial. Officially, they did not exist. The shock came gradually, then all at once. MiG pilots began to notice something unsettling. Sabres were no longer avoiding high-altitude combat. They were climbing to meet them. Not only that, they were surviving. Then they were winning. Kill ratios shifted. Experienced Soviet aces found themselves pursued in vertical dives they could not escape. The sky, once a sanctuary, became contested space. Reports flowed back through Soviet command. The Americans had adapted faster than expected. Their pilots were aggressive, flexible, and increasingly effective. The F-86, once dismissed as inferior at altitude, proved deadly when flown with patience and discipline. The psychological advantage began to erode. The moment of realization was not marked by a single battle, but by a pattern. Losses that could not be explained away. Encounters that ended differently than doctrine predicted. Below, on the ground, few civilians knew what was happening above their heads. Newspapers spoke in generalities. Official statements were cautious, but inside briefing rooms on both sides, The implications were clear. The Korean War had become the first true jet versus jet conflict in history, and neither side would ever look at air power the same way again. By 1953, MiG Alley had claimed hundreds of aircraft and countless lives. Exact numbers remained disputed, buried beneath propaganda and secrecy. But the outcome was undeniable. The United States had preserved air superiority. The Soviet Union had tested its technology and learned its limits. North Korea and China had witnessed the terrifying reality of modern aerial warfare, where control of the sky could decide the fate of armies below. Yet the true legacy of MiG Alley extended far beyond Korea. Every modern air doctrine, every emphasis on pilot training, avionics, and high-altitude performance traces a direct line back to those battles. The shock experienced when assumed dominance disappeared became a lesson studied in silence. Never assume the enemy will remain behind. Never assume altitude is safety. Never assume the sky belongs to you forever. Because in war, the most dangerous moment is not defeat. It is the moment a nation realizes the world has already changed.